In this lesson, we will be talking about body cavities and serous membranes. So, how is the human body divided? The human body can be divided into two portions, namely axial and appendicular portion. All right. So, axial portion is the portion that includes your head, the neck, and the trunk. So basically, the part in the skeleton colored in blue. So the head, the neck, and the trunk, this region, right? And appendicular portion includes your upper and the lower limbs. Why do we have body cavities? What's the function of body cavities? Body cavities are simply there to maintain internal organization. Okay, so body cavities are nothing but internal spaces. And these spaces help house, protect, and separate several internal organs. So if we have to list down key functions of the body cavities, one would definitely be to protect internal organs. Okay, so that's one function. For example, say your brain is protected by this cavity from external shocks. The lungs that are present within this cavity are also protected. So that's one function. The second function would be that these cavities allow organs to change shape. So, for example, say the lungs or your stomach or your bladder, they are able to contract and expand because they're located within these cavities. So, the cavities typically allow these organs to function without disrupting the activity of the nearby organs. The axial body cavity is, as you can see here, is further divided into the dorsal body cavity and the ventral body cavity. So dorsal body cavity is this region right here, this region, all of this part right here. This is your dorsal body cavity, which encloses the brain and the spinal cord. So this part here is called the cranial cavity, and this is the vertebral cavity, because vertebral cavity is the cavity that encloses your spinal cord. Cranial cavity encloses your brain. The ventral body cavity is further subdivided into thoracic cavity, which is right here, and we have the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Abdominal and the pelvic cavities together are called abdominopelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity is further subdivided into mediastinum and the pleural cavity. Pleural cavity is the one that encloses your lungs. Mediastinum is the cavity that houses your esophagus, the trachea, the large blood vessels, and also your heart. So the cavity of the heart, which is called the pericardium, is part of your mediastinum. All right. Now, the axial portion of the body. We're now going to be talking about the axial portion. Remember, the axial portion includes the head, neck, and the trunk. Okay, so the axial portion of the human body is further divided into two major cavities. One of them is the dorsal cavity, and then we have the ventral cavity. Now, what's the dorsal cavity? Remember, in our previous video, we've talked about anatomical terminology. Dorsal refers to posterior, while ventral refers to anterior parts of the body, right? So this is the anterior part of the body. That's the anterior part of the body, also known as ventral. And this is the posterior part of the body, also called dorsal. So the body cavity that exists in the dorsal part of the human body is called the dorsal cavity. This cavity is responsible to protect the nervous system, which is mainly the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, while the ventral body cavity, the anterior one, is responsible to house the many of the internal organs that exist in that region. Internal organs of the body are called viscera. It's useful for you to remember this word because we will be using this word later in the video. So viscera are simply the internal organs. The dorsal body cavity is divided into two subdivisions. We have the cranial cavity and the vertebral or the spinal cavity. So these are the two subdivisions of the dorsal body cavity. Now, what is the cranial cavity? Cranial cavity is the one that houses the brain and it protects the brain, while the vertebral cavity is the one that encloses the spinal cord. All right? So just like the brain and the spinal cord are continuous, uninterrupted structures, likewise, the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity are continuous. And the brain and the spinal cord are protected by the bones of the skull and also the cerebrospinal fluid that exists and cushions the brain and the spinal cord. All right, so this is all about the dorsal cavity. Now let's move on to the ventral cavity or the anterior cavity. The anterior cavity has two main subdivisions. If I have to take you to another figure which shows both the lateral view and the anterior view. So this is part of the ventral body cavity, as you see here. The ventral body cavity consists of two main subdivisions, the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity is this region that you see here. Let me just point out here. Yep. So this region here is called the thoracic cavity, and the region below the diaphragm is called the abdominopelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity is more superior subdivision of the ventral cavity, while the abdominopelvic cavity is the one that's more inferior. Remember the terms inferior, superior. All right, so the thoracic cavity is the more superior subdivision, while the abdominopelvic cavity is the more inferior part of the ventral cavity. The thoracic cavity consists of the organs such as your heart, the lungs, and structures like the large blood vessels, the esophagus, the trachea, all of those structures. Now, so the thoracic cavity is further subdivided into the mediastinum. Then we have the cavity that encloses the lungs, and also we have the cavity that encloses the heart that falls within the mediastinum. Right? So this is the thoracic cavity. Moving down to the the abdominopelvic cavity. The abdominopelvic cavity is the largest cavity in the human body. So what is it that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity? So we have a diaphragm right here. This is the diaphragm, all right? So the diaphragm is the structure, a thin sheath of muscle that separates the thorax from the abdomen. So That's what differentiates these two subdivisions of the ventral cavity. Um, and this is your abdominal cavity, and that's the pelvic cavity. Okay, but there's no clear demarcation, or there's no physical membrane that separates the abdomen and the pelvis, the pelvic cavity, and therefore we call this as the abdominopelvic cavity. Okay, so now let's look at membranes of the ventral body cavity. The serous membranes, also known as serosa. The serous membranes are very thin membranes that cover the walls and organs within the thoracic and the abdominopelvic cavities. Now let's look at a schematic diagram to clearly understand these organs, the membranes that protect these organs. Now assume that that's an organ in the ventral cavity, and this is the cavity within which that organ is present. All right. Now we have membranes within this cavity that protects the organ. So we have one membrane that lines the wall of this cavity. This membrane is called the parietal membrane. Parietal membrane. All right. So parietal membrane is simply the membrane that lines the walls of the body cavity. Parietal itself refers to cavity wall. That's its meaning, and therefore the name parietal membrane. We also have another membrane that lines the wall of the organ, that lines the organ itself. Okay, so this membrane is called the visceral membrane. So visceral membrane is the internal membrane, while parietal membrane is the external membrane. All right. So visceral membranes lines the organ, while parietal membrane is the one that lines the cavity wall. All right. Now these two membranes are separated by a space, and this space is called the serous cavity, which is filled with a fluid. Right. It's filled with a fluid, and this fluid is called the serous fluid. Right? So this is basically what our serous membranes look like, where they're present, and the organization itself. So the same concept applies to all of the organs within your thoracic and the abdominopelvic cavities. Okay, so now let's look at some examples. Remember, pleural cavity is a cavity that lines your lungs, right? Now, if you look at this diagram, the lungs are covered and lined with the pleural membranes. Okay, so let's look at this. This is our lung that we see here. That's the lung, a portion of the lung. And then we have the pleural cavity right here, which is filled with the pleural fluid. Okay, the serous fluid called pleural fluid because it's in the pleural cavity. Then we have the visceral membrane out here, which lines the organ, all right? And we have the parietal membrane right here, okay? Since the parietal membrane is in the pleural cavity, we call it parietal pleura, and we call the visceral membrane as the visceral pleura. So that's the membranes of the lungs, all right? Next, we come to membranes of the pericardial cavity, which encloses your heart within the mediastinum. Now, right here is our, I hope you're able to state what that is. That's the inner membrane which is lining the organ. So definitely that's the visceral membrane. All right, it's simply called visceral pericardium, visceral membrane, or visceral pericardium. Then we have the outer lining up here. All right, this one, that's the parietal pericardium, and the space here is the pericardial space, which is filled with the serous fluid. Okay, now this visual here is simply just to help you understand and visualize what this looks like. So assume that that's your organ. Imagine you put a fist into an air balloon or a water balloon. All right, so you will have a lining of the balloon that touches your fist. So that's your visceral pericardium of the visceral membrane. The outer lining will be the the parietal membrane, and the air or the water that's present in this balloon is the serous cavity filled with the serous fluid. Okay, so likewise in the abdominopelvic cavity we have serous membranes, which are called the peritoneum. So this here, this lining, which is the membrane on the cavity wall, is called parietal peritoneum, and this right here, which is lining the organs, this membrane is called visceral peritoneum. And the fluid-filled sacs that these membranes produce are meant to cushion and reduce friction of the internal organs as and when they move. And because the abdominopelvic cavity is large and contains several organs, it helps to divide this region into smaller areas for study and for analysis or for diagnosis. So to promote clear communication, for example, say a patient has come up with abdominal pain. So locating the pain would be easier if this large region is divided into smaller parts. So typically, the abdominopelvic region is divided either into 9 regions or 4 quadrants. The regional approach is more detailed, while the quadrants approach is a more simpler approach and a more commonly used approach in medicine. So, what does this quadrant approach look like? So, we have here um, the abdominopelvic cavity divided into 4 parts or 4 quadrants, like we would have on a graph. So, we have a horizontal line and a vertical line that are intersecting at the patient's navel. So that's the navel, also called umbilicus or the navel. So a vertical line and a horizontal line. So this approach is called the quadrant approach. So how do we name these 4 quadrants? So right here we have the right upper quadrant and we have the left upper quadrant. The lower quadrants again are called right lower quadrant, and we have the left lower quadrant. So this is the quadrant approach. As I said, the more detailed approach is the regional approach, which divides the cavity into 9 regions. So how do we do this? We have one horizontal line immediately right under or inferior to the ribs. So that's the horizontal line just under your ribs, and one superior to the pelvis. So we have 2 horizontal lines, and then we have 2 vertical lines from remember, these are parasagittal planes because they're not at the midline, right? So these are 2 parasagittal planes that are dropped down. Okay, so in this way, we've divided the abdominopelvic cavity into 9 regions. The middle region Right here is called the umbilical region. The reason is known to you because it's here where we have the umbilicus or the navel. Okay. Then the region right above and below the umbilical region is called epigastric. Epi means above something, and hypogastric, hypo means below. Okay, so epigastric and hypogastric. Then we have the right sides and the left sides. What are they called? So this right here, we have the right hypochondriac region, and we have the left hypochondriac region. Okay, then we've got the right lumbar region and the left lumbar region. Likewise, the last bit here is the right iliac region and the left iliac region. So it's important for us to know which organs fall under each of these regions and quadrants. And you can clearly see here. So if I have to quickly mention, say, in the quadrant approach, in the right upper quadrant, you may have, you definitely have got your liver, the gallbladder, the right kidney, some parts of the stomach, and the small and the large intestine. All right, some portions of the small and the large intestine. Likewise, in the left upper quadrant, you have say your stomach, the remaining part, I mean, the most part of your stomach, the left side or the left lobe of your liver, the left kidney, portions of the large intestine, etc. The left lower quadrant includes the most parts of the small intestine, the large intestine. It includes the reproductive organ, like, say, the left ovary in females. And the right lower quadrant includes, say, the appendix. Again, reproductive organs are part of this. Some portions of your small intestine are also part of this right lower quadrant. Now, these divisions, that is the quadrant approach, is most often used in clinical settings to diagnose issues like, say, appendicitis in the right lower quadrant, or, for example, gallbladder issues in the right upper quadrant. Likewise, you can then go ahead and identify organs that fall under each of these regions of the abdominopelvic cavity. That's all for from me in this lesson. Thank you for watching.